share that with others. Whenever the gifts of God stop with you and go no further, they're not fully meeting the intention of those gifts. When Abraham in the Old Testament was blessed by God in so many amazing ways, he told Abraham, I'm doing this so that through you others will be blessed. And so as Christians, we want to become really conduits of God's blessing and grace to others, extending that to others as we go throughout our lives. And I want to tell you a little story on myself. A few years ago, Tina and I were traveling with our travel trailer, and we were actually coming home from a vacation trip we'd been on, and we stopped at a little RV park that we've stayed in a few times. It's kind of handy because it's on the way home, and it's close enough that the next day we can kind of make it home in a pretty easy run, but it's still nicely treed. It's just a great kind of off the beaten path spot that we like to stay in. So we pulled in there at night. Of course, we're getting in there late, and so they have the little nighttime box. You fill out your site number and your license number, and you drop it in the box with your check. And we went in and checked in, and then we went to our site and parked and stayed there the night. And we don't tend to be, we got to get up at 5:30 and hit the road. We're kind of like, we've paid for the night. We're here for a little bit. So we're kind of lounging around in the morning, and I'm walking Buddy around, and I'm just enjoying the day. And that nice morning, just a beautiful setting. And along in the little golf cart comes a lady who I guess is managing the park, and she's driving by, and I just wave and say good morning, and she just kind of looks at me, and I'm standing like by my trailer in my site, and she looks at me and gives me what I would have to define and describe as the stink eye. I wasn't ever sure what people meant by that, but she defined it with the look that she gave me, and I'm like, what is wrong? She's just, I thought, okay, maybe it's a bad morning. And then later I'm out walking Buddy down around, and she comes walking by, taking care of some other tasks. And I just kind of smile at her, and she's just, once again, this look. And I'm like, wow, what is there something, does she not like my dog? I mean, I don't know how to fix that really, but what is it she doesn't like about me, or what's wrong with her? And then in my head, I'm thinking, this woman should not be working in hospitality. She's in the wrong field. This is not the way you treat paying customers at your RV park. I don't know how they're going to succeed if this is the kind of people they have working the front desk. These are the kind of people they have representing them. And I'm thinking to myself, and then the Lord just spoke to me and said, Bart, try to, I know you're a pastor on vacation, but you're not a Christian on vacation, okay? So think about what would be a great Christian response to this. So I thought, we've always enjoyed the park. It looked like they were doing some nice fixing up and restoring some of these older parts of the facility. And so I thought, well, before we leave, it's getting close to checkout time. I've kind of hooked up, and I'm ready to go. And I'm going to one more chance. So I walked down to the office, and I walked into the office, and she looked up at me kind of again with that look, and I'm like, so I'm just put on my best Bart the Christian smile and best pastoral presence, and I said, we've stayed here a number of times, and I just wanted to say that what you're doing with the facilities and stuff, I think you're doing a great job. It looks really nice around here, and we have always enjoyed staying here. So I just wanted to let you know that before we left. I thought, man, this is nothing. I'm like, you couldn't warm this woman up with a Bunsen burner. She is just cold, And I'm thinking, no, maybe I should write the owners of this place, because I think there's a man. This couldn't be an owner. There's no way. This has got to be some middle management thing going on. So as I turn to leave, she says, excuse me. And I said, yeah. She said, are you planning to pay before you leave this morning? I said, excuse me? She said, are you planning to pay for your space before you leave this morning? I said, well, we paid for it. We dropped our check in the night drop. It wasn't in there. There's no check in the night drop. Well, I remember putting it in there, and so I said, could you look again? So she went over, and she opens up their little box inside, and there's nothing there. Well, I look at where it comes through, and so nobody's really developed a good system on the night drop. It's like there's a slot on the outside of the wall. Then there's the hollow space in the wall. Then there's the box on the inside. And I said, well, I know we dropped it in there last night. I said, could I take a look? And so I kind of looked through her slot, and I could see the envelope just sticking up from the hollow space in the wall. The insulation was just holding it up. And I said, well, hold it in. I said, well, here's our check. Well, that warmed her right up. And the reason I bring up that story today is because it's so easy sometimes to have a misunderstanding with people because we don't understand their perspective. There's something missing. We haven't had that conversation with them. But how quickly we can become offended at the way somebody treats us, and we just write them off. We just say, that person just. I was ready to write to the owners and say, you've got to get somebody else in there. This person's they're gonna sink your ship if you keep this up. Instead, she was actually doing her job. She's like, okay, are you going to pay for this, or are you just, what? I thought, and then of course I'm thinking, well, she should know. A guy like me, I would never, leave without paying. So this morning I want to talk about the grace and I'm using a word that doesn't fully encompass the idea of what we're going to talk about, but the grace that we receive of Christ of empathy. That's that place where Christ not only identifies with our feelings, with our challenges, but he fully identifies with our situation in life. He fully stepped into our circumstances. This is something we sometimes fail to do in life, is we receive this great grace from God, and yet we fail to really step into other people's circumstances, to try to understand their perspective, to find out what it is. If somebody's angry, why are they angry? If somebody is afraid, why are they afraid? We tend to say, well, they just need to not be afraid. Well, they just need to not be angry. And yet, sometimes finding out why somebody is angry is very important. There are times when I was a teacher and I'm in charge of other people's children, and I have a parent come in and they're angry, I can't just tell them, hey, would you tone it down? Would you just stop being angry at me? I don't like it. No, I had to say, help me understand why you're frustrated right now. Help me understand what it is that's going on that I can help you with. One of the things that I find in today's world, where we no longer, we do less and less face-to-face communication, less and less even phone communication. We're sending texts, we're sending emails, if we want to emphasize something and show somebody the importance of it, we just do it all in caps. Somebody told me, when you do it all in caps, that means you're yelling at them. I just thought it meant I was excited about something. The way people take what we communicate, and there was a couple one time that they came into me for some counseling, and one of the first things they did was pull out their phones and show me the texts that they had been sending back and forth. I said, okay, that's got to stop, guys. You never argue by text. You will never make your point by text or email. You will never, by writing something, win somebody over. You will never find any advantage relationally by doing that in writing. You might feel better because you got it out. But when somebody can't see the look on your face, when they can't hear the intonation in your voice, when you're not there to listen to their response and to see what they are saying to you, and to see what I heard? Not just listening to what they say, but seeing what they're saying, looking at the way that they're expressing it. If you're not doing that, you're not fully communicating. And it's time that we step back and realize that Christ took the time to be here. And we underestimate the value of that. We underestimate the value of Christ becoming human. The reason I read the passage this morning from John is because it's so amazing that John focused on this idea of Christ becoming human. Why was that so important to John? We'll talk about that in a little bit. From Hebrews chapter 4, if you'd like to turn there, we're going to read a few passages, different places this morning. The book of Hebrews is written to the Jews, and it's telling them that this new covenant that we live under with Christ, this new grace that we enjoy, is so much better than the old covenant, so much better than the old relationship where God's up there and we're down here, and we're trying to figure out from the letters he's left us what he wants done and how we can do that. And he's saying, no, this is different. This is a different kind of relationship you're going to have. And so the Jews had a high priest. And the task of the priests were to represent God to the people and to represent the people before God. So they were the intermediary that stood in that place. And this had to be a person who kind of set himself above the others. He had to be somebody who was without sin or lived very close to God in the sense, in a very holy life. But Hebrews chapter 4, beginning in verse 14, says, therefore, since we have this great high priest, you should capitalize that, this great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. We no longer have a high priest that is unable to sympathize or understand our weaknesses. But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. I like those 4 words. Just as we are. Do you ever think about Christ being like you? Of course, only without sin. Some people, even Christians, can struggle with the concept of Christ or Jesus being fully God. Certainly, the people who lived with him struggled with this idea. When they tried to wrap their minds around it, it only made them angry and they wanted to kill him. When he said, well, I am the Son of God. Are you making yourself equal with God? We've got to kill you for that. He didn't die because he was a criminal. He didn't die just because other people were sinners. He died because he claimed to be who he really was, the Son of God. God fully invested, fully manifest in human flesh. It's hard sometimes to wrap our minds around that. I remember having a conversation with a man that had been a Christian for many years, and he said, I'll just confide in you. He said, I have a hard time seeing Jesus as God. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around the deity of Jesus. Because to think that this person who lived amongst these fishermen and who lived a simple life on earth, who didn't come in glory and in power, but came in meekness and humility, to think that this was fully God. During VBS, one of the stories I got to tell was the story of the disciples out on the boat, and they're on the Sea of Galilee, and winds and storms can descend on that large body of water rather quickly and turn it into something that's peaceful and calm and that you can see across, into something that the waves are just churning, and the boats they had weren't very great back then. They were just barely going to get you across the water. So here his disciples are just wrestling and fighting to get across the water, and where's Jesus? He's sleeping in the back of the boat. He's snoozing. I mean, this is like a waterbed to him. He's just cruising along. This is great. Until one of the guys says, wake him up, wake him up. Do you not care that we're dying here? We could drown. So Jesus calmly just gets up, speaks to the wind, the waves. He says, peace, be still. And I just loved when we did this at VBS. And I said, peace, be still. These kids are going crazy, making this storm noise, and they stopped. I felt like God himself right there. To get that many kids to be quiet all at the same time. But in the midst of that story, but to think what that looked like to these disciples, to realize this was evidence that the man they were hanging out with was the guy who had created all this around them. This was the same God, this power that he had. There was no magic, no incantation, no trick that anybody could play that would bring a storm to a standstill. And yet Jesus did that. And they still had a hard time wrapping their mind around who he was. I understand that. But there's another side in our Christian walk that we also have a hard time wrapping around. We struggle with the concept that Jesus was also fully human. we struggle with that concept. We think, well, he kind of touched on our lives. He kind of came into the world, but was here more as an observer than a real participant. He was just here watching what was going on. But it's interesting that the Apostle John, who's believed to have outlived the other 11, begins his gospel, as we just read this morning, with the idea that God became flesh and dwelt among men. He begins with this idea that God actually became flesh. He became flesh and dwelt among men. And then in his first letter, which he was writing to the churches, it's always interesting to me to think, okay, you know where the churches kind of started in Jerusalem, and they had this truth and the apostles were there, but where were they starting to get off track? And John was the apostle who got to address some of the earliest challenges and ways that they were getting off the path. And he opens his first letter to the churches stating to them in 1 John 1:1, he says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life," meaning Jesus. He's saying this Jesus that we were with, we touched him, we saw him, we heard him. This was no specter. This was not some spirit. This was not some illusion that came down, because that's what people were beginning to say. Maybe this wasn't really God in the flesh. Maybe if it was God, he couldn't have actually taken on flesh. He couldn't have done that. So then John, why would he think that's so important? And I think this is critical to our understanding of the humanity of Christ. Just as we have to understand the deity of Christ to understand that we can worship Jesus. We can do that because he is God. You can't slip a piece of paper between the Father and the Son when it comes into the Holy Trinity. He is fully God, but he is also fully man. And why is that important? Why does John think it's so important that the church understand this principle of the humanity of Christ? I think it's as important back then, and I think it's important today. Because otherwise, we don't understand the price that Christ paid to be here with us. We don't understand fully what it must have been like to put off all that made him God to become human, to step into a human suit and to live amongst humanity. John uses Jesus as the human as an example of a properly lived human life. Because if Christ was not fully human, we could say of anything that he did, or any moral thing that he did, or any way that he treated somebody, or any love, well, that's easy for God to do, but I'm just me. But in fact, John is saying, no, he is the example of a properly lived human life. 1 John 2:6 says, "Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did." If I am in Christ, then I cannot make the excuse that, well, that's okay for Jesus, but it's not going to work for me. In fact, I'm called to walk in that righteousness that Christ walked in, to walk in the grace that he walked in, to extend that to others. He then proceeds to admonish Christians to love like Jesus loved. He says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. Why is he saying this? Because Christ, who became human, paid every price to love us. There was nothing he held back in his process of loving us. Nothing that he retained to himself. Nothing that he said, no, I can't go that far. He came even to the point of praying to the place of passion that his sweat itself was as blood on him. He came to the place of asking God, if this can pass from me, take it from me. If this can be done some other way. But instead, he paid the full measure as a human walking into that. There's no bit of pain, nothing that Christ avoided in that. Jesus fully identified with our human experience. Can you imagine what it must have been like for God, who knows everything, to hang out with a group of fishermen, guys who just, they're just trying to get through life. They're just trying to make it through. They're just trying to figure out one day at a time. And he's hanging out with these guys who will argue about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. This guy who had such absolute knowledge that even as a child he could go into the temple and lecture the teachers, and yet he didn't go to the temple and lecture the teachers. He went out and he gathered around himself tax collectors and fishermen and rebels, and he spent time with them. He fully identified with them. You've ever thought what it would take to fully understand another culture? I mean, we tour, which is we go and look at all the sites, and we might try some of the food, and we might do that. But have you ever thought what it would be like to actually get to know somebody from another culture, to hear their perspective on life, what things are like for them? If I really want to get to know somebody, let's say this lady, that Miss Stink Eye, that at the trailer park. I was judging her, but I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what her role was. I didn't know how her day was going. But getting to know who somebody is, really sitting down and understanding them. Some of you that are teachers know that there are times when before you judge a student, before you figure out what you think will fix them, you have to take time getting to know them. You have to maybe understand what it is that they're going through. There were times when, especially at junior high, I had students that were just driving me crazy. And I wanted to just put them in a box or something. What can we do? And finally, sometimes the Lord would give me an opening and I would just begin to ask them questions. I had one young man that was so angry all the time. It just seemed like he was getting in trouble, constantly kicking against me. It's like, what is going on? So finally one day I just sat down with him after I had given him about his 14th detention and said, what? I said, I just see you continually getting in trouble, and I'd really love it if you didn't do that, because I feel like you're just hurting your chances at other things. I said, can you tell me what is it that's going on? And he said, well, I knew he lived with his mom and a stepfather, and I had met them, and they seemed like decent people to me. And I said, what, if you can think of something right off the bat that makes you angry, what would it be? He said, I lost my dad about 3 years ago. I said, hey, that's really tough that you lost your dad. He passed away. He said, I've never gotten to go visit his grave. My parents don't want me to think about him. They don't want me to think about the life he lived and the lifestyle that he lived. And so they, in their thinking, they were going to separate him from that and move on and not revisit that. And he just wanted to go visit his dad's grave. You see, I could have just seen him as another rebellious kid, another challenge. But once I got to know who he was, once I got to know how he became this angry young person. How did you become this? What experience led you to this? Getting to know, what does he know and what does he think? Why does he think getting in trouble like this is going to make things better? Is it going to bring attention from his parents? What's going to happen? Why is he doing that? Getting to know, how did you come to this conclusion? Getting to know, what is it that somebody really holds dear? What is it somebody really cares about in their life? I found it interesting that a pastor friend of mine was talking about a program that they were doing at their church where people who were not Christians could come in and spend time with Christians, and they would sit at tables and they would share a meal together, and then they would watch a video that talked about Christ, and then they would sit around the table and talk about that and have a conversation about it. And he said the toughest part was finding Christians who could keep their mouths shut. You see, we as Christians, we think it's because of our Great Commission, our job is to make sure everybody knows what we think. Sometimes you've got to find out what somebody else thinks before they care what you think. Sometimes knowing what somebody else thinks will help you know how to address what's going on with them. Why do they feel the way they feel? Somebody says, well, I just hate, I don't need Christianity, I don't need church, I don't need any of that. Why do you feel that way? Why do you feel that way? One time I was working with a group of people who were working with young people in schools, And I said, let's ask a question here, because I knew they were very focused on doctrine. And I said, if you have a young person ask you, as a Christian, do you believe if somebody commits suicide, will they go to hell? So what's your response? What's your answer to that? And it was interesting to watch. Well, I think scripturally, and they were talking about the scriptural response, and they were thinking about this and all the background, and they got done, and I said, well, you know what I think the right answer is? I said, I think the right answer is, what makes you ask that question? You've got a young person using suicide in a sentence, and you're not interested in why they're doing that? You see, we tend to be focused like that. You see, I'm not called to excuse sin, but I am called to understand sinners. I am called to understand sinners. Christ came and he began to show that he understood this weight. He said, yeah, even he carried the weight of temptation. He had victory over it, which is often harder than giving into it. He fought the tougher battle, but he still identified with it, with us. He has called us not to be out of the world, but to be in it, but not of it. That's a phrase we use, taken from Jesus, who said, the world's hated them because they're not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. We're not of the world, but here we are in it. Just as Christ came, was not of the world, but he was in it. And he was fully in it. Again, he wasn't just a spectator going, what's going on here? What's happening? You know, it's interesting, Nero himself, when he was a young emperor, he would actually put himself in disguise and go amongst his people in Rome. And he would go amongst where people, nobody would know who he was. And you'd think, well, that could serve some noble purposes. Instead, all he did was play tricks on people. All he did was insult people. All he did was do everything he could to get them angry at him. And then if he needed to, he could call his tribune guards in to protect him. That's not the kind of visit that Christ made. Christ fully identified with our feelings. We sometimes think emotions are bad. Well, we've all got them. And if it's a disease, well, we've all got the disease then. But in reality, emotions are also what draw us toward each other. The root of that is something that moves you. I'm really glad there's something that can move us, that might move us to serve, that might move us to love, that might move us to give. Emotions aren't always bad, but Jesus understood those emotions. You know, when Jesus came to the graveside of his friend Lazarus, Mary, his Lazarus' sister, came out and met him and said, oh, if you'd only been here, he would be alive. And in that little passage, we read the shortest verse in Scripture. It simply says, Jesus wept. When he saw her weeping, when he saw her sadness, the human side of Jesus joined in that weeping with her. He knew what the outcome would be. He could have smiled and said, hey, wait, you haven't seen nothing yet. Instead, the human side of him was moved with that compassion. The same way, we can come alongside others who are struggling and understand their struggle. We can try to get to know it just as Jesus fully identified with that human side, with their humanity. Romans says to rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Jack London, in 1902, he decided to get to know what was going on the east side of London. So he spent several weeks living in what's called the Whitechapel district, the poorest section of London. He spent nights in the workhouses in disguise, not as a wealthy author, but as a poor person living there. He spent nights out sleeping on the streets. He took a room from a very poor family. That was the best accommodation that he had. From that, he wrote the book called Into the Abyss, in which he described the true living conditions of those who were in this Whitechapel district of London, smashing a lot of the myths that people had and wrong ideas people had about how people lived during that time. He stepped into their world, into their way. Jesus is fully committed to our interests. Jesus is fully committed to your best interests. Philippians 2, 4 through 9 says, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. That's the challenge, isn't it? Getting that same attitude. I can get a bad attitude pretty easily. I can get a selfish attitude pretty easily. I can get to feeling like why are they looking at me like that? But I should have that attitude that Christ had, right? And what did he do? He said, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. He took the very nature of a servant, and being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, and then became obedient to death, even death on a cross. During the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, Casper ten Boom, he's a watchmaker who lived with his two daughters, but a solid Christian man. He saw the poor treatment of the Nazis under the Germans. Poor treatment of the Jews under the Nazis. And when they were requiring Nazis to wear yellow stars on their arms, Casper stood in line to get his own yellow star to put on his arm. He wouldn't allow them to suffer that by themselves. He identified with them. He then, when a woman came to his door, knocking on his door and said, we've heard that you sometimes help Jews. They've taken away my husband. I know they're going to take me and my children next. Can you hide us? He and his daughters began a process in which they hid several Jews and helped them get out of the country and get to safer places. Led to Corrie ten Boom, his daughter, writing the book, The Hiding Place. Do you know that the whole ten Boom family eventually spent time in the prison camps for the work that they did? When Casper ten Boom was arrested, and he was an older man, he knew he was in ill health, and they said, we'll let you go because we'll let you die at home, old man. Why don't we just let you go? You just have to promise not to do this anymore. You know what he said? He said, if you send me home, he said, I will open my door to anyone who knocks on it. He would not leave anyone out. He identified fully with the interests and concerns of those around him, not even sparing his own life. Jesus fully identified with our fallen estate. This is what's really grips my heart about this. Couldn't Jesus have waved a magic wand and just said, all's forgiven. All's forgiven. Let's just start it all over again. But he knew that simple forgiveness only brings us back to the place we started. And what will we do? We'll end up right back where we were. He knew something needed to happen to fully restore that fallen humanity. I think of the birth of Christ. We often only think about that during Christmas, but it should be an image that's always with us. This idea that God himself became so humble as to be born as a baby into a poor manger, in a poor family, in a poor place, that he might fully identify with our fallen estate. His first visitors were shepherds from out in the fields who saw the angels and heard the angels singing. Even the wise men that came from afar looking for him, they first looked in a palace to see if they could find him there, but that's not where he was. He was living in a simple place, living under the weight of a Roman emperor that all were feeling the weight of. He was born into a family with imperfect human beings around him, and this was God himself. I like a story about a man who was driving along a road that paralleled kind of a creek down in the south. Now, if you travel in the south much, there are places where the road does parallel creeks, sometimes the bayou areas. And those little creeks, you would hardly call them creeks. You would probably call them a slough. To look into the water is nothing but murk and algae and darkness. To know that within that water are snakes possibly alligators, crawdads, everything that you would not want to be spending time with. Is so you can't even see into the water. It's so dark. And as he's driving along, he sees along their piers, little like small piers out over the water where the poor people nearby go out to fish and to try to catch what they can out of the water to eat. And he's thinking, oh man, I'm sure glad I don't even have to eat anything out of that water. He's driving along the road. And suddenly he sees a car up ahead of him pulled quickly off the road by one of those piers. A nice car. Man steps out in nice clothes, well dressed. He jumps out of the car. As he's running out to the pier, he's stripping off his jacket and he dives into this water. And the other motorist, seeing that happen, he's thinking, that is the worst way to commit suicide I can even imagine. So he reluctantly pulls over to the side and he walks out to the edge of the pier and he looks down. Should I go in? Should I try to save him? What should I do? And in a few moments, the man who had first dived in comes up to the surface, but not alone. He's carrying with him a small boy. You see, he had seen the small boy fall into the water. He knew that the waders he was wearing and the equipment he had on him would pull him down to the bottom. So the man did the first thing that came to his mind. He just pulled off the road and ignoring the condition of the water and ignoring everything around him, he just dove down in, blindly could not see, swam down to the bottom until he could feel this young man and brought him back to the surface. The other man then helped him out. And I love that story because I think that had to be the perspective of the angels that watched Jesus on that Christmas night and said, what is he doing? Why is he going into that? Why would he dare go into that? Why would he risk everything to go into that? Does he not know what he's going to suffer by being there? Does he not know the pain that he'll go through? Does he not understand what that could do to him? And they, I'm sure, just stood on the brink and looked and said, what would cause anyone to do that? But yet, he did it to recover lost humanity. He dove to the depths of lost humanity to recover the beauty and the dignity and the promise of those who are uniquely, fearfully, and wonderfully made to commune with God. You see, he saw the beauty of humanity. One of the reasons we have a hard time wrapping our mind around the humanity of Christ, because we think of humanity being like us. But God sees the promise of humanity. He sees the uniqueness of our creation. He understands that we have been made to commune with him. And Jesus dove into the depths of everything that stunk and everything that was bad and everything that we could imagine to even heap on him in order to pull back to the surface that which was redeemable in humanity. That is more than empathy. That's full identification with our station in life. Even when we were dead in our trespasses, God made us alive together with Christ. Who do you know? Who can you think back to? Who descended in some way to your level of spiritual darkness, not in sin, but exposed himself to you, to your attitude, to your perspective, perhaps to your language, to bring you a light by which you finally found the surface? I think back to a Pentecostal preacher that left his Pentecostal church to go run a scout troop with a bunch of rowdy boys who didn't care anything about God. And yet he invested himself. He rubbed elbows with us. He heard our coarse jokes. He counseled us in things that our parents would never have wanted to talk to us about. And he reached down into our world. He identified himself with us and our need. in order to give us the light we needed to come to the surface. You know that when a diver gets so far down in dark water, they can actually lose track of which way is up. One of the things they tell a diver, if you get it disoriented, follow the bubbles. A person can actually forget something that simple. But sometimes we need somebody to tell us which way is up. Someone who will enter into our world and where we are, into the prison, into the place of work where we are, and the life that we live, and be willing to identify with us, to hear our story, to get to know what makes us tick, to hear our complaint even, to reach beyond the surface. We have to continue diving into this lost world, being in it, yet living by a much higher standard of grace, not being of it. That's our task, to dive in again and again to this lost world. Rubbing elbows with the stink eye people, loving and caring about them, hearing their story, and telling them ours. You see, Christ broke the myth that it's impossible to rub elbows with sinners and keep from sinning yourself. He broke that myth. We can live by the Christ standard. We can live the life that he lived and yet live in this world, but not be of it. That's the great grace that he extended to us, because he could only lift this burden off of us by first getting under it to lift it. And so he did that, to bring us back to the surface. Would you stand with me as we conclude this morning? Father, I thank you for the empathy, in fact, the total abandon of Christ in entering into humanity. To hear their stories, to walk with them, to counsel them through their bickering and their arguments, to sometimes shake his head and wonder at their inability to understand or take it in, and yet to patiently do it again and again, and then to go to the cross for those who would even deny that they knew him. I thank you that Jesus shouldered this load of sin for us, to lead us not back to where we were, but to a place of grace ourselves, where we understand what it is to live as Jesus lived. Father, call us to that place. I pray that you bring healing to those places of division where we have decided that somebody's just too angry with us, too frustrating to us, too distant from us, or too different from us for us to be of any use to them. I ask you to help us reach past the looks and the words, and to listen and to earn the place of sharing which way is up. Father, we ask you to help us dive into the depths of this world, whether it's at work or at school, in our place of business, as we're traveling, even vacationing, that you would show us opportunities to dive in and bring life to those who are caught in the darkest waters. Father, we ask this now in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Amen. God bless you, and pray that you have a blessed afternoon.